The widow came into sundown with blood in her mouth, the taste of rust and grit, a communion she had come to expect from the town of Providence. They called her Ilara, but the name was a dead thing, a relic of a husband the fever took and a life that had been burned away with his pyre. Now she was just the widow, a vessel for their spite, a magnet for every stone a child's hand could find and every curse a man's tongue could spit. The street, a gash of pale dust between two crumbling ridges of rock, was her gauntlet. They said she brought the blight to the corn and the sickness to the wells, their superstition a thick, choking smoke that clung to her thin dress. She walked through it with her eyes fixed on the cracked earth before her, her silence a wall they could beat against but never breach. Her home was a lean-to of scavenged planks clinging to the town's bitter edge, a place where the wind sang its thin, lonely dirge through the gaps. Inside, she would touch the fresh bruise blooming on her cheekbone, a purple desert flower, and feel not pain but a dull affirmation. She was still here. The world could flay her, but it had not yet scoured her from the bone. That night, as a sliver of moon bled light onto the floor, she saw a shadow detach itself from the deeper shadows of the bluffs. A man on a horse, still as a monument. It was him. The rancher. Silas. He was the town's other ghost, a man they spoke of in whispers, a creature of rumor and documented violence. He did not watch her with the town's rabid hunger, but with a flat, unreadable stillness, as if she were a feature of the landscape he was committing to a map drawn only in his mind. Silas was a man carved from the same hard granite as the canyons that cradled Providence in their indifferent grip. His ranch was a half-day's ride out, a solitary fortress of timber and stone that seemed to grow from the earth rather than stand upon it. The town feared him for the quiet that surrounded him, a quiet they knew was coiled around a history of swift and terrible finality. They remembered the last men who had ridden out to his land with intent, and how Silas had returned to town alone for supplies 2 days later, his face as empty as the sky. He watched Ilara not with pity, but with a kind of professional assessment. He saw the geometry of her suffering, the precise angles of cruelty inflicted upon her. He watched as the merchant shorted her rations, his thumb heavy on the scale. He watched as boys scattered stones at her feet like poisoned seeds. He saw the raw, chapped skin of her hands, the hollows beneath her eyes, and the unbroken line of her spine. In her, he did not see weakness. He saw an appalling and fascinating endurance, a thing of immense resilience being hammered into a new shape on the anvil of the town's hatred. He had seen men break for less. He had broken men for less. Her survival was an affront to the town's narrative, a quiet rebellion they could not stamp out. From his perch on the ridge or from the dusty anonymity of the saloon's shadows, he tracked her movements, a silent, unintended guardian whose protection was, for now, nothing more than the weight of his gaze. She felt it sometimes, a pressure at the back of her neck that was different from the usual prickle of malice. It was cold, assessing, and strangely impersonal, like the watchfulness of a hawk circling high overhead. The change came on a Tuesday, under a sun that baked the very air to a brittle shell. A fever had taken another child, and the town's grief needed a target. It found one in Ilara as she drew water from the communal well. A woman shrieked a curse, and this time, the curse was followed by a rock, thrown not by a child but by the grieving father. It struck Ilara high on the forehead, opening a cut that bled freely, the bright crimson a shocking sight against the pale canvas of her face. She did not cry out. She simply dropped her bucket, the splash a sound of terrible finality, and stood there, swaying slightly, as the blood traced a path down her temple. Then, a presence shifted the air. Silas was there. He had not ridden in, he had walked from the livery, and his sudden appearance was as if the earth itself had produced him. The crowd fell silent, their hate curdling into fear. He walked past them, his boots leaving crisp prints in the dust, and stopped not before the man who threw the stone, but before Ilara. He looked at the blood on her face, his expression unchanging. Then he looked at her shack, a thing of utter desolation. He turned back to her, and for the first time, she heard his voice. It was low, rough, like stone scraping stone. "Come," he said. It was not a question or a request. It was a statement of fact, an alteration of the world. He turned and began walking toward his horse. He did not look back to see if she followed. He knew she would. The town watched, mouths agape, as the widow, blood still wet on her face, turned her back on the only home she had and followed the silent rancher out of Providence forever. The word bride would be on their lips by morning, a way for them to understand what they could not comprehend. It was not a marriage, but an extraction. His house was not a home, it was a bulwark. The timbers were thick, the stone foundation sunk deep into the earth, and the windows were narrow slits that watched the surrounding emptiness. Inside, it was Spartan, clean, smelling of pine soap, leather, and wood smoke. For Ilara, it was a cathedral of quiet. The first days were a ritual of silent acclimation. She found a pail and a brush and scrubbed the floors until the wood shone with a pale, weary light, her movements methodical, erasing a past she could not speak of. He gave her a room of her own, bare save for a bed and a small chest. It had a lock on the inside. He never tested it. They existed in parallel orbits, their days defined by the stark necessities of survival on that unforgiving land. She would rise at dawn, stoke the fire, and prepare a meal of coffee and bread. He would already be out, mending the long, lonely lines of his fences or tending to the 3 horses that were his only livestock. They ate their meals at a rough-hewn table, the silence between them a living thing, dense and solid. It was not an empty silence, but a shared one, built from a mutual understanding of a world that offered no quarter. He would place a slab of jerky on her plate, she would refill his cup. These small, functional gestures became their language. She watched his hands, scarred and capable, as he oiled a saddle or repaired a harness. She saw in their efficiency a kind of peace. Here, everything had a purpose. There was no room for the town's chaotic malice. The land was a harsh master, but it was an honest one. Its threats, the drought, the wind, the predators, were clean and without spite. Under this roof, shielded by his name, she felt the raw, abraded parts of herself begin to scar over. One evening, after they had cleared the table, Silas placed an object between them. It was a long-bladed knife, its steel dark and purposeful, its wooden handle worn smooth with use. He did not say a word. He simply pushed it across the table toward her. Ilara looked at it, then at his face. His eyes were flat, expectant. She reached out a tentative hand and curled her fingers around the grip. It felt alien and yet strangely correct in her palm, a weight of cold, lethal potential. He nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible motion, and left the room. The knife was the first lesson. The second came a week later. He led her out behind the barn, where a line of rusted tin sat atop a fence post. He handed her his rifle. It was heavy, a solid, uncompromising tool of wood and iron. She had never held a firearm before. He stood behind her, not touching her, but his presence was a steadying force. He showed her how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. "Breathe out," was all he said. The first shot was a violent concussion that jarred her to the bone, the bullet kicking up dust far wide of the mark. She did not stop. Day after day, she practiced. The recoil that once felt like a blow became a familiar push. Her aim steadied. The act of loading the cartridges, chambering around, feeling the cold, mechanical certainty of it, became a ritual. She was no longer just mending clothes and baking bread, she was learning a new and terrible grammar. She was learning to answer the world in a language it understood. She was forging her own name, not with words, but with the slow, deliberate mastery of focused violence. The fragile peace of their shared solitude was broken by the arrival of a rider, a nervous man from a distant settlement who delivered a letter into Silas's hand and refused to stay even for a drink of water, fleeing as if the ranch itself were cursed. Ilara watched from the doorway as Silas read the single sheet of paper. She saw his shoulders tense, a subtle tightening of the muscles along his back that was more eloquent than any shout. He crumpled the letter into a tight ball, his knuckles white, and cast it into the fire. It flared brightly for a moment, the words turning to black ash, but their message lingered in the air like a foul smoke. From that day on, a new tension settled over the ranch. Silas's silences grew deeper, his gaze fixed on the long, winding dirt road that led to their sanctuary. He cleaned his rifle nightly, the rhythmic scrape and click of the cleaning rod a somber prayer against what was coming. One night, as he stood on the porch staring into the vast, star-drowned darkness, Ilara heard him whisper a name into the wind. Cain. It was not a name but a condemnation, a sound like a stone dropping into a bottomless well. The word hung in the air between them, an unspoken history of blood and betrayal. Ilara knew, with a certainty that chilled her marrow, that this was the debt from his past. Cain was not a rumor. He was a promise, a rider moving inexorably toward them across the blighted plains, bringing a reckoning that Silas had long outrun but could not outrun forever. The fortress they had built was about to be put to the test. The town was the first tremor before the earthquake. Emboldened by whispers of Silas's old enemy, perhaps even goaded by Cain's unseen influence, a small deputation of Providence's most righteous men rode out to the ranch. They came not as a mob this time, but under the thin veneer of law, their leader a portly merchant who had always looked at Ilara with a particular kind of contempt. They stopped at the fence line, their faces a mixture of fear and self-importance. "Silas," the merchant shouted, his voice thin in the open air. "We've come for the woman. She's a curse on this town. It's time she was brought to account." Silas stepped onto the porch, rifle held loosely in one hand. He did not answer. He simply stood there, a figure of absolute negation. The men shifted in their saddles, their resolve wavering under his silent stare. It was then that the cabin door opened, and Ilara stepped out to stand beside him. She held the knife he had given her, its blade a sliver of cold light in the afternoon sun. She did not look like the broken thing they remembered. Her hair was tied back, her gaze was level and hard, and her stance was rooted to the ground she now considered her own. The merchant's eyes widened. This was not the victim they had created. This was something else entirely. As the silence stretched, becoming its own form of weapon, Ilara raised her chin. The gesture was small, but it was a declaration of war. A tremor of uncertainty passed through the men. They had come for a witch, a scapegoat. They found a queen standing beside her grim king on the battlements of their keep. Without another word, they turned their horses and rode away, their dust a plume of cowardice against the horizon. Cain did not arrive with a posse or a proclamation. He arrived like a plague wind, a solitary rider materializing from the heat shimmer of the plains. He was Silas's dark reflection, lean, weathered, and radiating a silence that was not stoic, but predatory. He dismounted by the well, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of a life lived by the blade and the gun. The confrontation was immediate, a collision of two histories. It happened in the bone-dry arroyo behind the barn. There was no talk of old debts, no grandstanding. It was a language of pure violence. Ilara heard the first gunshot, a sharp crack that splintered the afternoon quiet, and she ran, the heavy rifle in her hands. She found them in a brutal, rolling struggle in the dust. Cain was faster, a whirlwind of desperate savagery. Silas was stronger, a rock weathering a storm. She saw the flash of Cain's knife, a viper's strike. Silas cried out, a raw, animal sound of pain, and staggered back, his left arm hanging useless, blood soaking his sleeve and dripping from his fingertips. Cain turned, his face a mask of triumphant hate, and saw her. He smiled, a gash of white teeth in a dusty face. Silas was down, propped against the stony wall of the arroyo, his rifle just out of reach. The protector was broken. The shield was shattered. Ilara stood alone between her wounded ally and the man who had come to burn their world to the ground. The final debt was not Silas's to pay. It had been transferred to her. In that moment, she was no longer the widow, the outcast, or the bride. She was the last line of defense. The world shrank to the confines of the house, a wooden box besieged by a wolf. Ilara had dragged Silas inside, the effort a screaming agony in her muscles, and barred the door. He was fading, his breathing shallow, his face pale as ash. The house was her territory now, every creak of the floorboards, every shadow, a part of her. Cain was outside, patient. He circled the cabin, his footsteps soft in the dust, a predator testing the walls of a trap. Night fell, and the contest began. It was a battle of silence and nerves. He would tap on a window, a light, mocking sound, and she would move to the opposite side of the room, the rifle a cold, heavy weight in her hands. He tried the door, a sudden, violent shove that made the timbers groan. She did not fire. A shot in the dark was a wasted shot, a revelation of her position. This was her home, and she knew its darkness better than he did. The hours crawled by, each tick of the old clock on the mantel a hammer blow against the quiet. Then, a new sound. The scrape of wood on wood at the back of the house, by the small window in her room. He was trying to pry a board loose. This was the moment. She left the rifle, taking up the knife instead. It was a tool for close, ugly work. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, her bare feet making no sound. She entered her room, now a black cavern of shadow, and flattened herself against the wall beside the window. She heard his grunting breath, the splintering of wood. An arm reached through the new gap, fumbling for the latch. She did not hesitate. She lunged forward, not with a scream, but with a silent, focused exhalation of air, and brought the knife down with all the force of her new, hard-won existence. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and grey. Ilara sat on the porch step, the knife, wiped clean, resting on her lap. The air was still and cold, cleansed. Inside, Silas slept, his breathing shallow but steady. The fever from his wound had broken with the night. She had tended to him with a grim, practiced efficiency, stitching the gash on his arm with a needle and thread from her mending kit, her hand sure and steady. There was a new mound of earth behind the barn, a raw, unmarked scar on the land. She had dragged Cain's body there herself, a dead weight of finished business, and had buried him deep, returning the violence to the soil that understood such things. There were no words for what had passed, no ceremony. It was simply done. She looked at her hands. They were not the hands of the woman who had fled Providence. They were chapped and calloused from labor, stained with dirt and dried blood, but they were her own. She had scoured the flaws of her past, mended the fences of her present, and buried the threat to her future. A profound, sober quiet settled over her, a peace that was not happiness but something harder, more durable. It was the peace of sovereignty. She looked out over the vast, empty landscape, the harsh and beautiful wilderness that was her home. The sun crested the ridge, and its light touched her face. She did not flinch from it. Her gaze was as steady and unblinking as the horizon itself. She was the keeper of this silence. She was the mistress of this hard-won ground.